The first snow came early that year, before Thanksgiving. It drifted down over the northern hills of Michigan, soft and endless, the kind of snow that muffles the world until every sound becomes memory. 8-year-old Ethan Miller pressed his face against the frosted window of the farmhouse and watched the orchard disappear beneath white. The branches of the apple trees bowed under the weight, hundreds of them standing in rows like old men in heavy coats. Inside, the fire crackled, and the smell of cinnamon lingered from his mother's baking. His father, David Miller, tightened the laces on his boots by the door. "Storm's rolling faster than they said," he murmured. "I'll check the northern fence before the drifts cover it." His mother, Laura, looked up from kneading dough. "You should wait till morning." David smiled that stubborn farmer's smile. "And find half the orchard buried." "No chance." Ethan watched the red scarf she wrapped around his father's neck, the small kiss she planted on his cheek. He didn't yet know that these simple gestures were the kind that echo through an entire life. He just thought his parents were unstoppable, like the orchard, like winter itself. Outside, the wind howled. The screen door slammed shut behind David, and the world became a blur of gray and white. Ethan traced tiny circles in the window frost, pretending they were galaxies. His mother hummed a hymn as she worked the dough. "When this snow melts," she said softly, "your father will plant the spring saplings. You'll help him this year." Ethan nodded, his breath fogging the glass. "Can I name one after me?" Laura laughed. "We'll call it the Ethan apple, then." Hours later, darkness folded over the farmhouse. The storm thickened until even the orchard vanished from sight. The power flickered, then went out. Laura lit a lantern and set it on the table, its flame trembling with every gust that shook the windows. She kept glancing at the door. Ethan waited on the steps, listening for boots crunching snow, for the rattle of the latch. But only the wind answered. By midnight, fear had taken on a shape, a whisper in the walls, a cold breath on his neck. Laura wrapped a blanket around her son and pulled him close by the dying fire. "He's done this before," she whispered, though her voice quivered. "He'll be back by morning." When Ethan awoke, dawn was colorless. The fire was ash. The door stood open, snow piled inside the entryway. His mother's coat was gone. Outside, the storm had eased into a quiet snowfall that covered the footprints leading down the hill toward the orchard. Ethan ran to the window and saw nothing but endless white. The orchard looked like a frozen sea. He waited all morning, then afternoon, staring at the path until his eyes burned. No one returned. By evening, the neighbors came, Mr. and Mrs. Cole from the next farm, bundled thick in coats. Their faces told him before their words did. "The storm took the river crossing," Mr. Cole said, removing his hat. "We found the sled near the bridge." He stopped, voice breaking. "I'm sorry, son." The world folded inward. Sound retreated. The wind outside seemed to sigh his parents' names. Ethan didn't cry right away. Tears felt too small for something so enormous. He simply stood by the window where the orchard lay buried and whispered, "They'll come back when the snow melts." That night he refused to leave the farmhouse. The Coles offered to take him home, but he clung to the banister and shook his head. "If I go, they won't find me," he said. "They'll look here first." The sheriff left food, the neighbors checked in, but as days turned to weeks, everyone quietly accepted what Ethan could not. The snow hardened into ice, and the orchard slept under it like a graveyard of ghosts. One morning, Ethan bundled himself in his father's oversized coat and trudged into the orchard. The air bit at his cheeks. He found a single apple still hanging from a branch, shriveled, stubborn, red against the white world. He plucked it gently and held it close, as if it contained his parents' hearts. "I'll keep the orchard alive," he whispered, "till you come home." That promise became the seed of everything he would grow into. The weeks that followed blurred into one long gray breath. Ethan marked the days by how much snow had melted from the porch steps. When the icicles finally began to drip, he decided it meant spring was coming, and with it, the faint hope that maybe his parents had only lost their way. The neighbors still visited, bringing bread and jars of soup, but they spoke in soft voices outside the door, as though afraid to disturb the quiet inside. He would hear Mrs. Cole say things like, "Poor boy. He should come live with us." And Mr. Cole would answer, "He won't last the winter alone. We'll give him time." But Ethan stayed. He swept the floor, fed the chickens, stacked firewood the way his father had taught him. He even tried to mend the torn screen on the door, pricking his finger more than once on the wire. In the evenings he would sit by the cold hearth with the lantern glowing beside him, tracing the carved initials on the wooden mantle, D+L. When spring finally came, the snow receded like a curtain being drawn away from the land. Beneath it lay the orchard, soaked and bruised but alive. Buds began to form on the gnarled branches, tiny green hearts against a world still recovering from winter. One morning, Ethan took his father's gloves from the peg and walked between the rows. He remembered how his father's voice had sounded, low, calm, as they planted saplings the year before. Every tree has its own patience, his father had said. You can't rush an apple to grow, just like you can't rush grief to fade. Ethan crouched and pressed his small hands into the thawing soil. The earth was cold and damp, but it pulsed with life. He could almost imagine his parents beneath it, whispering back through the roots, "Keep going, son." He began his routine. Each morning, he carried a tin pail of water from the well and poured a little at every trunk. The orchard was too large for one boy, but he didn't care. He spoke to the trees as he worked, telling them stories, sometimes jokes. "You'd laugh," he said once to a particularly crooked tree, "if you could see how bad I am at chopping wood." By late April, the blossoms arrived, white clouds drifting through the branches, filling the air with scent. The townspeople passing by on the road would slow their trucks just to look. The miller's orchard had bloomed again, though the house behind it stood quiet and grey. Mrs. Cole came by one morning, standing at the gate while Ethan weeded near the barn. "You keeping busy, Ethan?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I have to. Dad says if you don't talk to the trees, they forget who you are." Mrs. Cole's eyes glistened. That sounds like something he'd say. She left a basket of fresh bread and a note pinned to it, for when the work feels heavy. He didn't open the note for days. When he finally did, it said only 4 words. "We're still here, too." Summer turned the orchard golden. Ethan harvested early apples, small and tart, and filled old baskets to take to town. People gave him coins out of pity, but he didn't mind. He saved every cent in a jar under the stairs. At night, he sometimes dreamed of the river where his parents had vanished. In those dreams, he saw their faces just under the ice, calm, unafraid, mouths moving in slow words he couldn't hear. He always woke with the taste of salt on his lips, unsure if it was from tears or from the dream water itself. One evening, as he was closing the barn, he heard footsteps crunching the path. He froze, heart hammering. Then a man appeared at the gate, a tall figure with a worn coat and a beard flecked with grey. "You the miller boy?" the stranger asked. Ethan gripped the rake handle. "Who's asking?" The man smiled faintly. "Name's Thomas. I used to work for your father, years ago. Heard what happened. Thought I'd stop by, see if you needed a hand." Ethan studied him, unsure whether to trust. The man's hands were scarred, calloused like his father's. His eyes, though tired, were kind. "I don't need help," Ethan muttered. Thomas nodded slowly. "That's what your father said too, first time I offered." He turned to leave, but paused. "If you change your mind, I'll be at the old workshop by the river." When he was gone, the orchard seemed to listen. The wind moved through the branches, carrying the faint scent of sawdust, and Ethan wondered if the stranger's words were a sign, or a test. That night, he couldn't sleep. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence pressing on his chest like weight. He went outside, barefoot in the dew, and looked toward the orchard where moonlight pulled like silver. "Mom, Dad," he whispered, "should I let him help?" No answer came, but the branches swayed as if nodding. By morning, Ethan had made up his mind. He would go find the man called Thomas. The next morning, the sun rose pale behind a veil of fog, the kind that made the world seem uncertain and half-formed. Ethan packed a small bag with bread, a jar of apple preserves, and his father's pocket knife. He left a note on the kitchen table, though there was no one to read it, saying, "Gone to the river. Be back soon." He followed the narrow dirt road that wound through the edge of the orchard and down toward the water. The river was still swollen from melted snow, its surface shimmering with morning light. The air smelled of mud, pine, and the faint sweetness of spring flowers. The old workshop stood where the land dipped near the bend. It had been used long ago for repairing wagons and farm tools, its roof sagging but still intact. Smoke rose from a small stove inside. Thomas was there, seated on a stool, mending a wooden handle. He looked up when Ethan entered. "Morning," Thomas said quietly, as if he'd been expecting him. "You walk all that way alone?" Ethan nodded. "Good," the man said, nodding. "Means you're not afraid of work." The boy hesitated, then spoke. "You said you worked with my dad." Long time ago, Thomas replied, setting his tools aside. Your father was a good man. Honest, stubborn as an old oak. Helped me get back on my feet after I came home from the war. Ethan blinked. The war? Thomas nodded. Before your time. Hard years. Your dad gave me a place to sleep and a reason to wake up again. Guess I owed him more than I ever said. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the pause between two breaths. Finally, Thomas said, You keeping the orchard running? Ethan straightened. I'm trying. I water the trees, keep the weeds down. Thomas smiled faintly. That's more than most grown men could manage. But you can't do it alone forever. Ethan frowned. I can. Thomas looked at him with patient eyes. Maybe, but even trees need a little help from the wind to spread their seeds. The words stuck in Ethan's mind. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the man work, sanding, fixing, humming under his breath. There was something steady about him, something that reminded Ethan of his father's calm when storms rolled in. By noon, Ethan had agreed to let Thomas help around the orchard. They walked back together, the path lined with early wildflowers. Your trees are coming along, Thomas said as they reached the first row. But they'll need pruning soon. Otherwise, the fruit will be weak. Ethan nodded. Dad used to say that too. Thomas smiled. He was right. They spent the rest of the day working in silence, trimming branches and clearing dead wood. The rhythm of it soothed Ethan's thoughts. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone in the sound of his labor. That evening, as the sky turned amber and the air cooled, Thomas packed up his tools. You'll do fine, kid, he said. Your father would be proud. Ethan hesitated, then asked, You think they're really gone? Thomas paused, his face unreadable. Sometimes, people leave the world. Other times, they just move into the parts of it we can't see anymore. Either way, they're not far. When Thomas left, Ethan sat on the porch steps, thinking about those words. He looked out across the orchard, where the wind moved softly through the leaves, whispering like old voices. That night, he dreamed again of his parents, but this time, they weren't under the ice. They were standing among the trees, smiling. His father held out an apple, red and shining. His mother said, It's not the fruit you grow that matters, Ethan, it's the heart you keep alive while growing it. He woke before dawn, tears damp on his cheeks. For the first time, they didn't feel like sorrow. They felt like a beginning. The summer deepened. Each morning, Ethan rose before sunrise, working beside Thomas. The orchard flourished, and so did the bond between them. Thomas taught him how to graft branches, how to read the sky for signs of rain, how to mend fences and sharpen tools. But as the months passed, Ethan began noticing something strange. Thomas would sometimes disappear for a day or two, returning with no explanation. His eyes would look red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. When Ethan asked where he went, Thomas only said, Just making sure old debts stay buried. One evening, near the end of August, they sat by the barn fire eating supper. The air was thick with the scent of ripening apples. Crickets sang in the tall grass. You ever think of leaving this place? Thomas asked. Ethan shook his head. No, this is home, even when it hurts to stay. Ethan looked at the dark silhouette of the orchard. If I leave, who'll remember them? Thomas sighed, staring into the flames. Sometimes, remembering can be heavier than forgetting. The wind picked up, scattering ashes into the air like tiny sparks. Ethan didn't answer, but in his chest, something shifted, a small ache that felt both like loss and like strength. He realized then that he was growing, not just taller, but older in ways grief could not measure. Autumn crept upon the valley quietly, like an old memory returning uninvited. The leaves turned gold, then crimson, then brown, falling in slow spirals to the earth. The orchard shimmered beneath a copper sun, each apple glowing like a small promise against the coming cold. Ethan had grown taller that summer. His hands were rougher now, his voice steadier. He had learned to mend fences, sharpen blades, and find meaning in the smallest sounds, the thud of apples in the grass, the whisper of wind through bare branches, the heartbeat of the soil beneath his boots. Thomas still came by most days, though the shadows under his eyes had deepened. He spoke less and worked more, as if the land itself demanded his silence. One evening, as they stacked the last baskets of apples in the barn, Ethan noticed Thomas holding a small, worn locket. The metal glinted faintly in the lantern light. What's that? Ethan asked. Thomas's hand closed around it. Just something old. Can I see? Thomas hesitated, then sighed and handed it over. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph, faded, almost gone, but Ethan could still make out two faces. His father and mother. Ethan's throat tightened. Where did you get this? Thomas stared at the floor. Your father gave it to me. A long time ago. Why? To keep safe, Thomas said softly. He said if anything ever happened to him, I'd know what to do. The barn went quiet. Only the wind moved, rattling the old boards. What does that mean? Ethan asked, his voice cracking. Thomas looked up. In his eyes, there was something heavy, something he had been carrying for far too long. Ethan, he said quietly, there's something I haven't told you. About that day at the river. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. You knew them, he whispered. You were there. Thomas nodded slowly. We went together, to help your father haul a shipment of lumber downstream. The current was faster than we thought. The raft capsized. Your mother, she tried to save him. His voice broke. I couldn't reach them both. Ethan felt the world tilt. The locket trembled in his hand. You, his breath caught. You left them? Thomas shook his head fiercely. No, I dived again and again. I tried until my lungs gave out. When I came up, the river had taken them. Ethan stepped back. His voice rose, sharp with grief and rage. You should have told me. I know, Thomas said. But you were just a boy. And I thought, maybe if you believed they'd only gone missing, you'd keep going. You'd still have hope. The boy's vision blurred. The world became sound and fury, the thrum of the wind, the hiss of tears hitting the dirt floor. Hope, he shouted. You lied to me. Thomas's shoulders sagged. Yes, because I thought I was saving you from the same weight that almost killed me. Ethan turned and ran, out of the barn, through the rows of apple trees now stripped bare, into the dark that smelled of rain and rot. He didn't stop until he reached the riverbank. The moon was rising, silver and hollow. The water glimmered with the reflection of stars. He could almost see them again, his parents, beneath the surface, waiting. He dropped to his knees. The locket hung open in his trembling hand. Why did you leave me? He whispered into the wind. Why didn't you take me with you? The river didn't answer, only the current spoke, a soft, endless murmur that sounded too much like the word stay. Hours passed. The chill bit into his skin, but he didn't move. When footsteps finally approached behind him, he didn't turn. Ethan, Thomas said quietly. Come back to the house. It's freezing. The boy shook his head. You lied. You don't care. Thomas knelt beside him. You think I don't care? Every day since that night, I've lived with their faces in my dreams. Every time I see you, I see the son they loved more than life itself. I didn't save them, but I swore I'd save you. Ethan's chest shuddered with a sob he couldn't hold back. Then why didn't you tell me? Because sometimes, Thomas said, voice breaking, the truth doesn't heal, it burns. And I couldn't bear to light that fire in you when you were still too young to stand near it. The boy pressed the locket against his chest. The metal was cold, but inside it was warmth, his parents' memory, their faces, their love. He didn't answer, but when Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, he didn't pull away either. They sat like that until dawn. The sun rose pale over the horizon, washing the river in gold. Your father once told me something, Thomas said finally. He said, a tree can't grow new branches until it lets go of the ones that died. He stood, his voice low. Let them rest, Ethan. But don't stop growing. Ethan looked up at the orchard in the distance, bare now, but beautiful even in its quiet death. I'll try, he whispered. When they walked back together, the frost sparkled on the ground like a field of tiny stars. That winter was the hardest of all. The cold came early, sharp and merciless. The house felt emptier than ever. But something inside Ethan had changed. The grief that once suffocated him had become something steadier, like a coal that glowed instead of burned. He spent his nights repairing the toolshed, fixing the roof, and writing in an old notebook he found in his mother's dresser. He wrote about the orchard, the seasons, the ache of loss, the small joys that still bloomed in quiet moments. Sometimes, he caught Thomas reading those pages when he thought Ethan wasn't looking. And though the man said nothing, the pride in his eyes spoke louder than any words could. By February, the snow came down heavy again. The orchard slept beneath it, silent and still. But Ethan was no longer the frightened boy who'd hidden in the shadows of grief. He stood at the window one night, the locket warm against his skin, and whispered to the wind, I'll make it grow again, Dad. I promise. Spring returned like forgiveness. The snow melted into the soil, feeding the roots that had slept all winter. The orchard woke slowly, stretching its limbs toward the sun. Buds formed on branches that Ethan thought had died, small bursts of green like quiet miracles. He had changed, too. His face had sharpened, his shoulders squared. The sadness that once hollowed his voice had deepened into something gentler, wiser. He no longer waited by the river. He no longer hoped to see his parents walking up the road. Instead, he spoke to them through the work, through every tree he pruned, every seed he planted, every breath he took in the orchard's quiet rhythm. Thomas still came by most mornings, though his steps were slower now. The years had caught up to him. His hair, once dark, was silver. But the bond between him and Ethan had settled into something like father and son, not by blood, but by choice. "Looks like you've done it," Thomas said one morning, watching Ethan graft a new branch onto an old apple tree. Ethan smiled faintly. "They did it. I just kept watering." Thomas chuckled, his voice rough but warm. "You sound just like him." That night, they shared dinner at the kitchen table, bread, stew, and cider pressed from last year's harvest. The lantern flickered softly against the windowpane, and for a brief moment, Ethan could almost see his parents there, her laughter, his father's steady smile, watching from the reflection. "Thomas," Ethan said after a long silence, "why did you stay all these years?" The old man leaned back, his gaze distant. "Because your father saved me once. I thought I was paying back a debt. And now," Thomas smiled faintly, "now I think it was never about debt. Maybe it was just finding something worth keeping alive." That night, after Thomas left, Ethan walked out into the orchard. The moon hung full and low, bathing the rows of trees in pale silver. He stopped at the oldest tree in the center, the one he'd planted with his father when he was 8. He touched its bark, rough and cool. "You're still here," he whispered. "So am I." Then he noticed something strange, a small carved heart, hidden beneath a layer of moss. Inside it were the initials he knew by heart, D+L, his parents' mark. He traced the carving with his fingers. For the first time, the ache in his chest didn't hurt, it hummed. The years moved quietly after that. Ethan grew into a man, tall and strong, with hands that told the story of his labor. The orchard became one of the finest in the county. People came from miles around for his apples, each one crisp, sweet, and touched by care. He never sold the house, never left the land. When he married and had a son of his own, he built a small swing between 2 trees and told him stories of the mother and father he'd lost too soon, but never really lost at all. Thomas grew old with him, his steps slow but his spirit unbroken. When he passed one summer morning, Ethan buried him beneath the oak near the river, beside a stone that read, "Thomas Reed, a man who helped things grow."
On the day of the funeral, the orchard was in full bloom. The air was filled with the scent of blossoms, the sound of bees, and the quiet pulse of life continuing. Ethan stood there a long time, the wind moving through the branches like a song only the trees could hear. Years later, when Ethan himself was an old man, his son found him sitting under that same tree, the locket in his hand, eyes closed, lips curved in a faint smile. He had gone as gently as a leaf falling from a branch, quietly, naturally at peace. At his funeral, people from the whole valley came. They spoke of his kindness, his strength, his quiet wisdom, but when the service ended and the crowd went home, his son lingered in the orchard. He opened the locket, looked at the faded faces inside, and whispered, "He kept his promise." And above him the trees swayed softly in the wind, branches heavy with apples, roots deep with memory. The orchard lived on, as it always had, a place of love, loss, and the quiet courage to begin again.